At the annual gala, my husband kissed me on stage, thanked me for supporting his dream, and 2 days later, transferred our entire company into another woman's name. Before I tell you how I walked back into that same boardroom years later, as their new CEO, hit subscribe. You'll want to hear every piece of this. Because what happened to me isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about how a woman who was written out of her own legacy rewrote the ending herself. My name is Ava Hayes. I'm 36 years old, a mother, a planner by instinct, and apparently the kind of woman men underestimate until it's far too late. For 12 years, I was married to Eric Hayes. To everyone else, he was a visionary, the founder of Hayes Innovations, a design and engineering company that built smart home systems before they became trendy. To me, he was a man who used charm like currency, generous when the world was watching, and cold when no one was left to see. We met when I was 22. I was a marketing assistant at a small agency, and he was the young genius pitching his prototype to our firm. He said I had the kind of brain that sees patterns where others see chaos. I should have known that was both a compliment and a warning. By the time we married, Eric had already started the company in our garage. I left my job to help him build it. Late nights, spreadsheets, client calls, website copy, all unpaid, all behind the scenes. He'd call me his secret weapon. I thought that meant partnership. When our son Nathan was born 3 years later, Eric insisted he carry his name, Nathan Eric Hayes. He said it was tradition. I thought it was love. Turns out it was ownership. Our life looked perfect from the outside. The big suburban home with floor-to-ceiling windows, a housekeeper who came twice a week, and matching black Teslas parked side by side. I'd host company dinners, plan charity events, and smile at reporters who called us a power couple. But behind that curated glow, something was missing. Me. Eric's world kept growing while mine shrank. He'd talk about the company as if I was never part of it. Meetings I used to attend quietly disappeared from my calendar. His assistant started forwarding me event invites instead of board updates. I brushed it off at first. Maybe he was just stressed. Maybe I was imagining it. But then came the gala. It was our 10th anniversary, both of the company and our marriage. The room was a maze of sequins and champagne, journalists and investors. The stage lights made Eric glow like the hero he always played. He took the microphone and said, "None of this would have been possible without my amazing wife, Ava. She's been my rock, my inspiration, the heart behind every late night." The crowd applauded. I smiled because that's what you do when your husband praises you in front of 200 people. But his hand on my back felt rehearsed, and the way his assistant, Rachel, looked at him from across the room, it wasn't admiration, it was possession. That was the first time I noticed her. Rachel Sutton, 28, sharp, efficient, and always one step too close. At first I thought she was just ambitious. Later, I realized ambition was the cover story. 2 days after that gala, Eric left for a conference in Chicago. He came back distant, distracted, short-tempered, glued to his phone. I told myself it was stress. But I've learned that stress doesn't make you whisper in hallways or smile at texts you try to hide. It wasn't until weeks later, while reviewing some insurance documents, that I stumbled across the name Sutton Holdings. It was listed as the new parent company of Hayes Innovations. At first I thought it was a typo. Then I looked closer. Eric's signature was on every page. The transfer date? 2 days after the gala. The new owner? Rachel Sutton. I remember sitting at my desk, staring at that signature, the same one that used to appear on love notes, anniversary cards, even the post-it reminders he'd leave on the fridge. Now it was the knife that cut me out of my own life. I didn't cry. Not right away. Shock does strange things to you. It doesn't break you, it freezes you, keeps you perfectly still while the world quietly collapses around you. I waited until Nathan was asleep that night before confronting Eric. He was sitting in his study, drinking his favorite whiskey, scrolling through emails like nothing had happened. I stood there for a long time, holding the printed documents in my hand. When he finally looked up, he smiled like I was interrupting something. Trivial. He smiled like I was interrupting something. "What's that?" he asked. "You tell me. You transferred our company to her." He blinked, then laughed. Actually laughed. "Ava, please. Our company? You weren't even listed as a partner. You helped with decor and morale. That's not ownership." That word, decor, hit harder than the betrayal itself. 12 years of sacrifice reduced to table settings? I said, quietly, "You built that company on my unpaid labor." He sipped his drink. "You're overreacting. Rachel helped structure the acquisition. It's just business. You wouldn't understand." That night, I understood everything. That my marriage was over. That the life I'd built was a stage set. And that Eric's greatest mistake wasn't betrayal. It was thinking I wouldn't learn how to play his game. I didn't scream. I didn't pack a bag. I just said, "Okay," and walked out of the study. In that moment, he thought he'd won. But I just started taking notes. The days that followed were quiet. Too quiet. Eric acted as though nothing had happened. He'd kiss Nathan on the forehead before work, text me from meetings, and make dinner plans with investors like the world hadn't shifted. But I noticed the smallest things. The email password he changed, the sudden interest in private accounts, the new key on his ring. That's when I began documenting everything. Emails, receipts, transfers. I didn't know what I'd do yet, but I knew evidence was power. And when you've lost everything, power is the only currency left. Still, it hurt. Every time I saw Rachel's name on an email or heard Eric say, "my company," something inside me cracked a little more. The woman I used to be, loyal, trusting, hopeful, was slowly dissolving. In her place, something sharper began to grow. I became quiet, observant, strategic. If he saw me as harmless, good. If he thought I'd stay small, even better, because small things can slip through cracks. And that's where I started planning my way out. But before I could rebuild anything, I had to survive. Emotionally, financially, mentally. That's when I found the old leather journal in my drawer, the one I used to track company notes during the startup days. Every entry, every sketch, every product outline had my handwriting on it. Proof that I was there, that I mattered. It wasn't evidence in the legal sense, but it was something more important. The reminder that I wasn't crazy. When you've been gaslighted long enough, you start questioning reality. But I had it in writing, and one sentence I'd written years ago would become my mantra. I may not own the title, but I built the foundation. And foundations don't disappear. They just wait for new architects. That's how my real story began. Not with a betrayal, but with silence. Because revenge doesn't start when you're angry. It starts when you stop reacting. And I had just gone silent.
Silence has a sound. It's not empty. It's sharp, like the moment before thunder cracks. That's what my house felt like in the weeks after the gala. Eric still played the part. He'd kiss me on the cheek before leaving for meetings, text me reminders about Nathan's piano lessons, even send me pictures of conference dinners. If you didn't know better, you'd think we were fine. But underneath it all was a rhythm, a rehearsed cadence of lies. I started studying him the way I used to study market trends. When he woke, when he showered, when his calls shifted from the office line to private. Every change told a story, and I began reading between the lines. At first, it was small things. A new cologne, a second phone charger in his briefcase, receipts for dinners in neighborhoods where we didn't know anyone. Each clue was a breadcrumb leading to something I already suspected, but wasn't ready to admit. Rachel Sutton wasn't just the assistant, she was the replacement. I wasn't angry yet, just observant. Anger burns fast. I needed something that burned slow. So I waited. When Nathan was at school and Eric was at the office, I started exploring the spaces he'd slowly shut me out of, like the home study, now kept under lock and key. It wasn't hard to find the spare key. Eric was many things, but careful wasn't one of them. I'll never forget the day I opened that door. The room smelled like whiskey and printer ink. Stacks of files covered the desk, financial statements, NDAs, meeting notes. And then there was the folder, a thick black binder labeled Transition Plan. Inside were documents about restructuring, rebranding, and ownership optimization. My name appeared only once, under non-essential personnel. 12 years, erased with a single phrase. What caught my eye wasn't my exclusion. It was the last page, a notarized agreement transferring ownership of Hayes Innovations to Sutton Holdings, executed under Eric's authorization, and the signature line for Rachel Sutton, CEO. For a moment, the world tilted. I could hear my heartbeat echoing in the walls. Then something inside me clicked. Not like glass breaking, but like a lock opening. I wasn't powerless. Not anymore. I took pictures of everything, every signature, every clause, every timestamp. Then I put the folder back exactly where it was. When Eric came home that night, he greeted me with a kiss on the forehead. "Long day," he said. "Yeah," I whispered. "Me too." The next few weeks were a balancing act. I played my part, school runs, dinners, charity calls, while studying corporate law in secret. I'd stay up until 3 a.m. reading articles about shareholder rights and marital property laws. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who claimed I wouldn't understand business had just motivated me to learn everything about it. That's when I realized the biggest flaw in his plan. He assumed I was naive. He didn't understand that when you treat someone as invisible, they learn to move quietly. And invisible people can see things others miss. One night, while checking old company emails, I found a thread from our earliest days, messages between Eric and our accountant, dated nearly a decade ago. In them, Eric had used our joint savings account to fund the initial company expenses. My name was on every transfer. That meant I was an investor, and under corporate law, that gave me claim to ownership. It wasn't much, but it was something, a crack in his empire. I remember sitting there, the screen light reflecting off my face, whispering to myself, "You made this mistake, and I'm going to build my way through it." From then on, everything I did had purpose. Every smile at dinner was a disguise. Every good luck text was reconnaissance. Every quiet moment was strategy. But playing along came with a cost. There were nights I'd hear him on the phone, laughing, whispering, using the same tone he once used with me. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering when exactly I'd stop being enough. I'd catch glimpses of Rachel in photos online, company events, trade conferences, private luncheons, always at his side, just close enough to be mistaken for a partner. She'd wear that same crimson lipstick I once wore to our first investor meeting. It used to make me feel powerful. Now it felt like a stolen identity. But if she was trying to replace me, she was about to learn, you can copy style. You can't copy strategy. Months passed, and the distance between us became routine. Eric had stopped pretending we were equal. He'd mention my company so often, it started sounding like a mantra. And every time he said it, I smiled. because I knew something he didn't. He thought this was the end of my story. It wasn't even the middle. The real turning point came one afternoon in early spring. Nathan had come home from school upset. His teacher had mentioned his dad's company during career week, and another kid said, "Your mom doesn't work, right? My dad says she just hosts parties." He cried when he told me that. It broke something deep inside me, because that's when I realized this wasn't just about revenge. It was about legacy, about showing my son that silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. That night, after tucking him in, I opened my laptop and started mapping out my plan. If Eric had taken 12 years to build his empire, I'd take half that time to reclaim it. I started small, taking online classes in business management under my maiden name, Ava Brooks. No one would connect the dots. The first few months were brutal, juggling Nathan's school, pretending normalcy, and studying corporate governance at 2 a.m. But I didn't stop. For every word Eric had ever used to belittle me, I found a page to prove him wrong. When he'd say, "You wouldn't understand," I'd write down the terms he used and memorize them. When he'd dismiss my opinions, I'd study why and learn to dismantle them with logic. The more I learned, the more his arrogance became my greatest teacher. Then came the unexpected ally, Mrs. Greer, our former accountant. She'd retired years ago, but still sent Christmas cards. When she called me one afternoon just to check in, I could hear something in her tone, hesitation, maybe guilt. "Ava, I don't know if I should be saying this, but I saw some documents cross my desk before I retired, and I think you should look into them. Something about asset transfers under your husband's name." She paused. I didn't want to interfere then, but "You deserve to know." My heart pounded. "Do you still have copies?" A silence. Then, "I keep backups. Old habits die hard." A week later, a small brown envelope arrived at my door. Inside, old ledgers, bank statements, and an internal memo noting founder's spouse contributions listed as equity in kind. Translation? The company acknowledged my labor. They just never paid me for it. It was the first tangible proof that my name belonged on those papers. I thanked Mrs. Greer and promised her I'd handle the rest quietly. She just said, "Good. Quiet is where the real work happens." She was right. By that point, Eric had started staying overnight in the city more often. He'd leave a trail of alibis so neat it almost looked rehearsed. That was fine. His absence gave me space to rebuild. Every night, I studied legal precedents and drafted what I called my contingency folder, a growing file of evidence, education records, and notarized statements. If I was going to reclaim my life, it would be done by the book, his book, only rewritten by me. I didn't want to destroy him. I wanted to replace him. And the best part about revenge through paperwork? They never see it coming. Then one night, around midnight, I saw a name flash across my email inbox. Rachel Sutton. She'd accidentally copied me into a thread meant for Eric. Subject line, "Audit Schedule Approval." My pulse spiked. The message included a calendar invite for a board audit meeting, the one that was supposed to finalize the ownership transfer. Date, 3 weeks away. Location, Hayes Innovations. That was it, my window. If I could get into that room, not as a wife, but as someone who understood the law, I could find the proof I needed. But to do that, I needed credentials, something no one could question. That night, I clicked enroll on the certification course that would change everything: corporate compliance and governance law. I didn't have time to waste. Every page I read, every note I wrote was one step closer to dismantling Eric's empire from the inside out. I didn't tell anyone, not my friends, not even my mother, because silence wasn't loneliness anymore. It was armor. And the woman Eric thought he buried in paperwork, she was quietly writing her comeback.
I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not my friends, not my parents, not even the neighbor who sometimes asked why I looked so tired all the time. I was quietly becoming the person my husband swore I'd never be. During the day, I still played the role, cooking, attending charity luncheons, smiling beside him in family photos. But at night, while he and his mistress were busy working late, I was learning how to dismantle their little empire. I dove into online business classes, accounting, corporate law, tax structures, the kind of stuff I'd once thought was too boring to bother with. But now it was fuel. Every term, every number, every clause felt like a weapon I was sharpening. And in between lectures, I studied our company's old filings, the business I'd helped him build from scratch. Back when we started, it was just a small consulting firm in our garage. I'd handled clients, scheduling, and finances, even though the official paperwork never listed my name. "It's simpler this way," he'd said. "You're my wife. You're already part of it." That's the thing about trust. It blinds you until it burns you. One night, I found something odd. It was a minor document, an old certificate of incorporation from 6 years ago. The founder section listed his full name and mine, not as a co-owner, but as founding partner's spouse. It seemed symbolic, meaningless, but my business law professor had taught me something crucial. A spouse listed in incorporation, even without equity, can carry significant fiduciary acknowledgement if the entity later changes control. That one line stuck with me. I wasn't just his wife. I was part of the origin story, and that meant something. So I dug deeper. Through public databases and quiet favors from an old accountant friend, I uncovered the paper trail. When he created the new company under his mistress's name, he'd copied everything: the clients, contracts, even the tax ID structure. Legally speaking, it wasn't a new entity. It was a continuation of the original, disguised as a transfer. And that's when I realized he hadn't stolen the business. He'd just moved it, illegally. My hands shook as I flipped through spreadsheets. I could see the transaction records. $4.6 million in assets moved into her name in one fiscal quarter. That was my son's inheritance, my life's work, and they thought I'd never find out. I started keeping notes, meticulous, time-stamped, encrypted, every account transfer, every email forwarded from his assistant, every suspicious expense. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I started preparing my next move. Because if I was going to bring him down, I needed to do it by the book. No screaming, no emotional outburst, just cold, surgical precision. I knew there would come a day when they'd both underestimate me again, when he'd laugh in front of the board, dismissing me like some fragile housewife, and on that day, I'd walk in with documents, legal filings, and proof that he'd transferred company assets through deception. But I wasn't ready yet. I needed something stronger, something that would make my claim bulletproof. And then I got it. One evening, while sorting through old invoices, I found a USB drive labeled Client Onboarding 2012. When I plugged it in, I expected spreadsheets or client lists. Instead, it contained signed contracts, digital copies of our first clients, each with both of our signatures. Mine wasn't just decorative, it was legal acknowledgement. 12 contracts, all dated within the first fiscal year. 12 records tying me to the founding and operation of the company. That was it, the nail in the coffin. But I couldn't act yet, not until I had my credentials, my own legitimacy in their eyes. So I doubled down, graduated top of my class in business administration, got certified in forensic accounting, built a reputation as a consultant, and when the time came, I applied for a minor auditing role under a new name. No one suspected a thing. I joined a financial oversight firm that handled mid-size corporate audits, and within 6 months, I made sure one particular company appeared on our radar, the firm my husband had transferred. It was almost poetic. sitting there in a crisp office, reviewing spreadsheets of the company I'd once helped build and quietly dismantling it from within. The numbers didn't lie. There were irregularities everywhere, personal expenses masked as business deductions, false ownership entries, forged board approvals. I didn't even need to expose everything. I just needed to plant a seed in the audit trail that would make the board nervous. Because when investors start asking questions, secrets don't stay buried for long. One night I went home early. My husband wasn't there. He was probably with her, discussing their future. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat on the couch, and looked around the house we'd built together. For years, I'd decorated these walls thinking they held love, but now they just held lies. Still, I smiled, because for the first time in years, I wasn't powerless. I wasn't the silent wife waiting for justice. I was justice, quietly, methodically building her case. And if he thought the board meeting next quarter would go as planned, he was in for a surprise, because I wasn't going to ruin him in private. No, I was going to end him in front of everyone.
When you decide to dismantle a life that was built on your sweat and your silence, you learn a few practical things quickly. People overestimate how complicated the truth is, and they dramatically underestimate how stubborn you can be when you finally care enough to fight. The audit I'd nudged into motion started like any other. A quiet email, a request for additional documentation, a polite but firm phone call asking for clarifying invoices. My role on the oversight team gave me access to channels that were otherwise closed. Vendor portals, archived board minutes, the private cache of contract revisions that never saw the light of day. I moved through them like someone who had once lived inside the house she was now inspecting. Everything felt familiar and painfully intimate. I learned 3 things in the first week that tightened the noose around him. First, the transfer to her name wasn't a single dramatic moment on a rainy afternoon with a notarized pen. It was a long, clumsy choreography. Shell companies, alter ego trusts, backdated memoranda, and a benign-looking consulting agreement that funneled client introductions and reoccurring revenue into a new corporation. They'd tried to make it look like a clean, arm's-length acquisition when it was, in truth, a slow bleed of value that left our original company hollowed out. Second, the mistress, her name, the one he wore like a prize, had no board resolution that legitimately gave her controlling interest. What she had instead were forged signatures, hastily drafted proxy letters, and one suspicious filing from a boutique law firm that specialized in quick shell entity formations. The law firm's contact person was a junior partner who smelled of smoke and nerves. They had been paid, yes, and paid well. But paper can be rewritten. Paper can be traced. Third, and most important, I was not invisible on the paperwork. My handwriting, my initials, my voice in contract attachments, in closed-loop emails, in early client correspondence were all there. Not as a nominal wife figure, but as an active operator. The contracts on that USB, 12 of them, were the beginning. The deeper I dug, the more I found. Expense approvals bearing my initials, client onboarding notes that used my email address and my login, a string of Slack messages where I had instructed the dev team on timelines, where I'd negotiated rates with vendors. I had every right to be furious. I also had the evidence to show I hadn't been a ghost. You learn very quickly how many people preferred the comfort of a lie over the discomfort of a truth. Most of the employees I reached out to, quietly in between required audit calls and scripted interviews, were relieved to talk. Relief, when it came, looked less like gratitude and more like permission. Permission to say what they'd been thinking in the safety of someone else's presence. It turned out a lot of them had known things in fragments. Late-night meetings, expense codes labeled discretionary, an intern who'd seen a master spreadsheet disappear.
People tiptoe around scandal until somebody walks in with a flashlight. It was in one of those flashlight moments that I found the ledger entry that made my stomach drop and my hands go steady at the same time. There it was, a series of payments to a consulting liaison that neatly paralleled the months when key clients' invoices began moving to the new entity. The liaison's bank account routed through one of those neat little boutique law firms. I kept following the chain until it led to an offshore advisory firm registered to the mistress's middle name. The handwriting on one of the authorizations looked suspiciously like my husband's. I saved the file, encrypted it, and sent it to a private folder I'd created for myself, a lockbox that only I could open. I'd built my case around facts, not feelings, and facts do not care if you are angry. Facts care whether you can present them cleanly, with chain of custody intact, and witnesses who will stand behind the documentation in a deposition. So, I set about building a fortress, corroborating witnesses, timestamps, metadata, IP logs that showed who accessed what on which day, and copies of the original contracts on USB drives, on cloud folders, and in printed form. I did not use brute force. I used redundancy. I left a paper trail that if anyone tried to burn it, they'd only end up scattering embers that would flare again. There was a risk to working like this. If he smelled that the audit was turning personal, he could call in favors, threaten to use legal teams to silence me, or spread a rumor that I was mentally unwell. Exactly the kind of weaponized narrative men like him understand well. I anticipated that. That's why my moves were surgical. I never logged into our company systems directly. I used the legal channels provided by the auditing firm. I never mentioned him by name in off-record conversations. I cultivated allies in places where men like him assumed wives wouldn't bother to look. The forensic accounting community, a retired corporate counsel with a quiet reputation for calling out fraud, and a paralegal who owed me a favor from a seminar I'd once organized in college. One night, after a 12-hour day of cross-referencing invoices against bank feeds, I unlocked another small mercy. A former CFO of the company, the man who'd quit quietly 3 years earlier after a family disagreement, contacted me. He'd been waiting, he said, for the right moment. He had kept copies of board minutes he'd found suspicious, backups we never expected him to keep. He handed them to me as if he'd been carrying a sleeping child who finally needed a warm bed. He told me something that would change the whole shape of the fight. He worried that if you ever got in a position to claim anything, you'd have to be more than the woman he dismissed in the first place. He made that mistake when he left you off the title the first time. The CFO's voice tracked pain and something like admiration. But you signed things. You were on the operational emails. Your name is there in ways you don't even recognize. You need to make them prove you aren't. That was the hinge I needed. The documents were not just paperwork. They were testimony to the role I'd played. They would strip the pretense that I had merely been a domestic shadow. I also uncovered something uglier, evidence that he had, in fact, used the founder's widow line as part of a fabricated narrative to justify the transfer. He had prepared a portfolio of stories, press-friendly and legal-sounding, that framed the mistress as a strategic partner who could take the company mainstream while he stepped back to focus on family. It was bold-faced gaslighting designed to appear benevolent. I let it sit in my folders like a time bomb. On a rainy Tuesday, I took a risk. I requested a private meeting with the audit committee lead, citing potential conflicts of interest and an unusual cluster of related party transactions. When the audit committee lead, an exacting woman named Evelyn, who tolerated nothing less than precise documentation, met with me, I laid out the broad architecture of the case without emotion. Point by point, The chain of transfers, the disguised revenue pipelines, the forged board consents, the absence of legitimate voting resolutions. I watched her face move from mild curiosity to controlled alarm. "Do you have the chain of custody?" she asked without looking up. I slid a folder across the table to her. It was heavy with paper, light with consequences. "Everything is timestamped, metadata intact. I've cross-checked bank feeds and IP logs. There's a clear path showing the assets moved well before any sale was executed." She read in silence, a small frown knitting her brows. "If this is what it looks like," she said slowly, "it means someone manufactured the appearance of a voluntary transfer and used corporate shells to hide the beneficial ownership. That's not a mistake. That's fraud." The word hit the table like ice water. It wasn't just a legal term in a textbook anymore. It was the lever that could pry open their carefully staged life. "Proceed carefully," she told me. "We will expand the scope of the audit, but if any of this is staged or unsourced, we need more than your word." She lifted her eyes to mine. "We need witnesses, signed affidavits, and a certified forensic report." I had the witnesses. I had the affidavits lined up. I had a forensic expert who owed me one from a charity auction I'd once organized in college. The pieces were aligning, but that did not mean the risk had evaporated. It meant the chessboard now contained many more players, and my husband, believing himself untouchable, would not play gently. After that meeting, I started to see the cracks widen in his behavior. He began calling more often, his tone sharpening with that familiar blend of condescension and suspicion. He arranged lunches with the CFOs and the law firm partners, casual meetings that felt like reconstructions of old power rituals. He asked family friends for word-of-mouth checks about me, a polite kind of surveillance. It was as if he was trying to find out when I...
There's a silence that comes before revelation, not the peaceful kind, but the sharp, breathless kind that hums just below your ribs. That's the silence I felt the morning the audit report was finalized. Evelyn, the committee lead, had emailed me at 5:43 a.m. Subject: completed draft, internal review. Body: meet at 9 o'clock. Board presentation scheduled next week. Bring the documentation we discussed. That was it. No pleasantries, no emojis, just the weight of a future that was about to split open. I brewed coffee I barely tasted, buttoned the shirt that had become my quiet armor, and looked at the folder on my desk, the one with my initials embossed in the corner. Inside it, 12 weeks of carefully built evidence slept like dynamite. Chain of custody logs, witness statements, certified metadata reports, the notarized confirmation that my husband's mistress had never been granted legitimate ownership. It wasn't just proof, it was a map leading straight to him. When I walked into the office, people felt it, that hum of impending reckoning. You could always sense when gossip had reached its saturation point. The air got taut. A few eyes darted away when I entered the hallway. Some looked relieved, others wary. The higher the floor number became, the quieter the corridors became. By the time I reached Evelyn's glass office, it felt like walking through the pause between lightning and thunder. "Close the door," she said as soon as I stepped in. She didn't look up from the report spread across her desk, pages filled with highlighted transactions, graphs and annotations in her tight, exacting handwriting. "She assumed you've read it," she asked. I nodded. "Twice." "Good. Because you're going to need to be steady. This is going to rattle more than a few people." She finally looked up. Her gaze was clinical, but not unkind. "You've been careful, Ava. That's why this works. Every claim is verifiable. Every transfer is traceable. They can't spin this into a misunderstanding." She paused. "And you know what that means? It means the board can't ignore it anymore. It means your husband will come for you." She wasn't warning me out of fear. It was out of respect. The kind of respect women in power learn to show each other when they've both seen what happens to the truth when it threatens the wrong man's comfort. "I've been preparing for that," I said quietly. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then let's make sure he can't prepare for you."
The audit summary was set to be presented at a closed interim board session, before the annual meeting, before the shareholders, before the press could spin it. That gave me exactly 5 days. 5 days to reinforce every seam in the structure I'd built. 5 days to ensure that when the moment came, there would be no plausible deniability left. I spent those days moving like clockwork, precise, deliberate. Every night, after putting our son to bed, I'd sit in my small home office under the soft yellow light, reviewing contracts line by line. My printer hummed until dawn, spitting out pages of black and white vindication. In one of those long nights, I found something that almost made me laugh. A memo my husband had drafted to the board 2 years ago, claiming that Ava was grateful for the chance to step away and focus on family life. Grateful. That word alone could have fueled 1,000 years of quiet fury. I traced my fingers over the printed signature, his looping initials, confident and careless. He'd always said he was good at managing perception. He was about to learn how it felt to be managed by truth. The night before the meeting, he called. "Hey," he said, voice soft and coaxing. "Been a while since we talked. How's our little man?" "He's asleep," I said flatly. "It's late." "I know, he sighed, perfectly timed. "Look, I know things have been tense, but I don't want you to think I'm the bad guy here. You and I built something together, okay? Whatever happens, I want us to stay civil, for his sake. Civil. You transferred everything we built to your mistress, and you want civility? God, Ava, it wasn't like that. It was a restructuring for tax reasons. You wouldn't understand. Try me." He hesitated. That was all I needed to hear. "Good night," I said, and hung up. I didn't need him to confess. I already had his confession in PDFs and metadata reports. He just didn't know it yet. The next morning, the boardroom looked like it always had. Sterile, expansive, the skyline stretching behind glass walls. 12 chairs, polished wood, water bottles arranged in neat symmetry. You'd never guess a corporate battlefield was about to unfold here. My husband sat near the head of the table, phone in hand, laughing lightly with 2 senior partners. He looked relaxed, too relaxed. His mistress wasn't present, but her absence hummed in the air like a rumor. Evelyn entered last. The moment she sat, the room quieted. She adjusted her glasses and began distributing copies of the audit summary. My husband smiled faintly, confident. He was used to these meetings, used to controlling the room with his charm and authority. "Thank you all for coming," Evelyn began. "As part of our standard oversight procedures, an independent audit was conducted over the past quarter. Today, we'll discuss findings that affect both financial integrity and corporate governance." My husband nodded along, pretending interest. "Excellent. Let's ensure we're all compliant." When Evelyn flipped to the 3rd page, her tone shifted, subtle but sharp. During the review, our team discovered a series of irregular transfers between the parent company and a secondary entity, Aurora Consulting LLC. I watched him freeze, just slightly. The name hit home. These transfers represent roughly 68% of recurring revenue over the last fiscal year. However, the receiving entity was not properly disclosed in board filings. Moreover, the entity lists as its majority shareholder one Vanessa Claire Dunn. Vanessa, the mistress. You could have cut the silence with a blade. Evelyn went on, her words crisp. Further investigation revealed that the transfer lacked board authorization. Supporting documents contained inconsistent signatures, some of which our forensic specialist has flagged as potentially inauthentic. My husband leaned forward, feigning calm. "There must be a mistake. Vanessa was contracted as a consultant. We outsourced marketing assets." "No," Evelyn interrupted. "You outsourced ownership." She turned a page, revealing the audit appendices. Revenue flows, client migration logs, and authorization emails, none of which passed through official board channels. More concerningly, several documents list a co-founder who is unaccounted for in recent filings. That was my cue. Evelyn gestured to me. "Ava, could you confirm the documentation?" I reached into my folder, pulling out the authenticated copies. My voice was steady. These are the original contracts from the company's founding period, signed by both of us, witnessed and notarized. I was listed as co-founder and operations lead. My name appears on all initial client agreements. You could hear someone's pen drop. My husband's expression flickered from disbelief to calculation, the kind of look a magician gives when his trick fails mid-performance. "Impossible," he muttered. "You weren't on the founding paperwork." "Then perhaps you should look closer," Evelyn said coolly, "because our legal review confirms Mrs. Whitaker's ownership stake was never revoked and that any transfer conducted without her consent is void." The silence after that sentence was symphonic. He tried to recover. We'll need to verify these claims independently. This seems like a personal dispute, not a corporate matter." Evelyn didn't blink. "The company's assets are corporate matters, and this," she tapped the folder, "is fraud." The room rippled with whispers. One of the senior board members, a man who had always followed my husband's lead, cleared his throat. "If these findings hold, we have a fiduciary obligation to act." The words fiduciary obligation might as well have been a gunshot. They meant that he was no longer the king of this table. Evelyn leaned back. "We'll proceed with a vote at the shareholders' meeting next week. Effective immediately, both the transfer and associated consulting agreements are suspended pending legal review." He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, with forced calm, he said, "This is outrageous. You're basing this on doctored documents from a bitter ex-wife." I met his eyes across the table. Doctoring documents takes creativity. I only brought truth. For the first time in years, he didn't have a rehearsed line ready. The meeting adjourned with procedural murmurs and legal phrasing, but the air in that room had changed. Power had shifted, invisibly but irrevocably. I walked out first, leaving him surrounded by the very people who had once laughed at his jokes and toasted to his deals. By the time the elevator doors closed, I allowed myself the smallest, most dangerous thing I'd denied myself for years: a smile. The next few days were chaos wrapped in decorum. Emails flew, lawyers whispered, the audit expanded further. The mistress's name began disappearing from the website's leadership page overnight. PR statements were under revision. Anonymous tips reached the media desk of a business blog, probably from someone inside who wanted to be on the right side of history. I kept my head down. No gloating, no public commentary. My weapon had always been silence, sharpened with precision. But behind that silence, I was building something else. Evelyn had mentioned the upcoming shareholder meeting. She'd said, "If the board votes to reopen leadership discussions, someone credible will need to stand."
When the day of the annual shareholders meeting finally arrived, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me in the mirror. Gone was the wife who once waited for phone calls that never came, or the mother who cooked dinner while her husband worked late. In her place stood the woman my husband created by underestimating me. My black suit was custom-tailored, sharp, elegant, not loud, but commanding. The kind that whispered power instead of screaming for it. My hair was sleek, my makeup deliberate, no emotion, no distraction, only intent. And around my neck, I wore Grandma Elise's pendant, the one she gave me the day I married Daniel. "Always keep your truth close to your heart," she'd said. I smiled at my reflection. "I kept it, Grandma, every word." As I entered the downtown conference building, I noticed Daniel pacing in the lobby, sweating through his $1,000 suit. He looked anxious, distracted. For once, I didn't feel small beside him. He saw me and froze. "Ava, what are you doing here?" I smiled lightly, "Just attending the meeting. I am, after all, the founder's wife." He stuttered. You weren't invited." "Oh, but I was. By the board." I brushed past him, leaving him standing there speechless as I made my way to the main hall. The room was filled with investors, journalists, and cameras. Every executive from our company's early days was there.
even those who'd taken Daniel's side when he pushed me out. I took my seat in the front row, directly across from Melissa, the mistress. She looked smug, dripping in diamonds, sitting beside Daniel like a queen. I just smiled, because today she was sitting on a throne made of paperwork, and I'd signed every page that would bring it all crashing down. The meeting began, with the chair of the board taking the podium. Before we proceed with annual statements, he said, we've received a formal request for a governance review and internal audit findings. Daniel shot up from his chair. This is absurd. We already settled those matters privately. The chair ignored him. As per the bylaws, the petition was filed by a verified shareholder holding over 10% equity. The room murmured. That was a powerful threshold, one usually reserved for founding partners. Daniel's face paled. He hadn't realized that when his ego made him the sole CEO, he'd left behind a paper trail showing that Ava Mitchell, legally, was still registered as co-founder on several legacy filings. And over the past year, I'd quietly bought back small fractions of stock under different LLCs, each one under the radar. Together, they formed 12.4% of total voting shares. That was enough to call this meeting to order on my terms. The screen lit up. A slideshow began, not of projections or profits, but of documents. Contracts, filings, bank transfers, and time-stamped communications. I'd worked for months with a quiet team of auditors and attorneys, people who didn't just know corporate law, but knew how to unravel deceit. The first slide, a memo signed by Daniel himself authorizing a transfer of company assets valued at $14.2 million to a shell company, Lyra Ventures, owned by Melissa Crow. The second slide, a document from the corporate registry showing that Lyra Ventures' founding documents were filed by Daniel's assistant 2 weeks after he took sole control. Gasps echoed across the room. Then came the third slide, the kicker. A signed clause buried in an old operating agreement that Daniel himself had ignored. It stated that any asset transfer exceeding $1 million required co-founder consent. That co-founder was me. Without my signature, every document he filed, every transfer he made, was null and void. Melissa's smirk vanished, Daniel's jaw slackened. The lawyers in the back row started whispering furiously, and I just sat there, still as a lake before a storm. The chair turned to me. Mrs. Mitchell, do you wish to make a statement? I stood up slowly, meeting every eye in the room. For years, I was told that my work didn't count, that raising a child, managing our lives, building from the ground up, was nothing, that I wasn't part of the business because I didn't sit behind a desk. I looked directly at Daniel. But you and I both know the truth, don't we? I was there before the first contract, before the first client, before the first check cleared. I built this company with you, and you tried to erase me. A silence fell over the hall. Even the reporters stopped typing. I continued, you stole what we built and handed it to someone who never earned it. You thought I wouldn't notice, but I did. I learned. And today, I'm taking back what's mine, not out of revenge, but because it's right. The chair nodded, then turned to the board. Per the bylaws, the transfer of assets was unauthorized. It must be reversed immediately. Then came the motion that would seal everything. Motion to reinstate Ava Mitchell as acting CEO and co-founder pending legal review. Every hand but Daniel's and Melissa's went up. The vote was unanimous. The cameras flashed. Reporters whispered. Daniel stood up, shouting, "You can't do this. This is my company." The chair calmly replied, "Correction, it was your company.
Now it's ours again. Melissa grabbed her purse, muttering curses under her breath as she stormed out. Daniel followed, face red, muttering, "You'll regret this, Ava." I didn't even look back. I was too busy signing the acceptance papers, my pen steady and deliberate. That night, when I finally came home, I found my son waiting on the couch. He looked at me with wide eyes. "Mom, is it true? You're the CEO now?" I smiled, exhausted but proud. "Yes, sweetheart, it's true." He grinned. "Does that mean we're rich?" I laughed softly. "No, it means we're free." He hugged me, tight and real, the kind of hug that reminded me why I fought so hard. As I tucked him in later that night, I whispered quietly, "You have your father's name, but I hope you carry my strength." He smiled sleepily. "I already do." Later, alone in my study, I opened the company's new ledger on my laptop. Beside the CEO title it read, Ava E. Mitchell, Acting Chief Executive Officer. I stared at the name for a long time, not out of pride, but out of peace. Every late night, every tear, every humiliation had led me here. I thought about the words Daniel once said to me during our last fight. "You'll never earn this title, Ava. You don't have what it takes." Now the title sat right beside my name. I closed the laptop and whispered into the quiet, "Looks like I earned it after all."